Baker's yeast shortage COVID. You could basically do a sourdough starters. Make a slurry of water, flour and yeast. Keep feeding it every day or keep it in the fridge when not needed. It is not the best way to keep a pure isolated strain of yeast, but if you are only using it for baking it should work fine. This is pretty much what I'm doing with my bread. I have a mother that started off as a bit of dough with a pinch of yeast a few weeks ago, and every day I make more dough, mix them together, and a few hours later take half of that to make bread. It's working brilliantly, making light and good tasting bread that I'm eating every day, and all from literally a pinch of dried yeast between my thumb and index finger. You should be able to propagate it just like you do with brewer's yeast. It's not actually clear to me that there really is such a thing as bread yeast that's truly distinct from brewer's yeast. There are lots of farmhouse brewers all over Europe brewing good farmhouse ale with lots of different bread yeasts. My understanding is that baker's yeast releases more CO2 than brewer's yeast, causing the bread to be lighter, whereas brewer's yeast will still work, but results in a denser bread. Here you can't get the prepackaged small amounts of yeast for consumers. But if you go to a bakery, even within a supermarket, they'll give you blocks of yeast cut off from the industrial quantities they have in the back. Bakers buy yeast by the tub turns out. Saying that, everybody baking at home is on board the sourdough train right now. Sourdough train check-in and choo-choo. r/sourdough can help you with inspiration facts and links. This has been on my mind since people started panic buying and bread was constantly sold out. Figured I could make my own, then noticed yeast was sold out too. After asking around I finally got a few packets. Guess sourdough is the way to go. As brewers, I guess we can't help but be yeast enthusiasts as well. I use baker's yeast to make rum. Molasses contains all the nutrients plus sugar you need, if you have access to any. In the past I made good bread from brewer's yeast, even from bottled dregs, although it takes some time to feed them sugar to grow colony for a bit, and even yeast cake. Few things, it does not raise as fast or as much and be careful with dregs and slurry, if it is too hopped, the bread will be very bitter. I make beer bread pretty regularly, it's really easy and not much rise time. Great wish I had bread for this meal bread that you can make in 45 minutes or less. That said I once used an IPA to make beer bread, notice I said once, and never, ever again. This is one case where the Big Three is better than a lot of the craft beers, no off tastes to add to the bread, because, hey, no tastes at all. Make a sourdough starter using organic whole wheat or rye flour. They contain all the bacteria and yeasts you need for baking. There's an abundance of information on the internet outlining various ways to get a starter going and keep it viable. You can use white flour for a starter, and store-bought yeast, use a bit of yogurt for the bacteria and you don't have to worry about failed starters or off flavor/smells. If it isn't a sourdough starter it is just called a sponge, you can keep a sponge alive in your fridge/counter the same as you do a sourdough starter, you just have to be a little more careful about the cleanliness if you don't add a helpful bacteria. I wondered about making baking yeast starter a couple days ago just in case, but I spotted disadvantages of that idea. The original baking yeast are easy to use because of their fast activation. Fresh starter is very powerful as it were stored at hunger state. In opposition, storing the same yeast on stir plate wouldn't give you the same, and it will still need couple more hours for dough to get the same effect. So in that situation it's better to make sourdough, which tastes better and is easier to use. Now in my neighborhood in Poland we also have problem with availability of baker's yeast at groceries because of COVID. Fortunately my sourdough was doing well. Unfortunately local demand focused now on flour. I was just able to buy a jar of instant yeast at Walmart but every other store seems to be out. Was contemplating a sourdough starter or harvesting from the one last packet of active yeast I have but had never tried either before and was unsure. A sourdough starter is a great thing to have anyway. Easy to do, and if you don't bake regularly just keep it in the fridge and feed it once per week. A lot of Italian and French bread is made from a biga, or poulish, which is basically a bit of pre-fermented dough, in the case of biga from the last bread you made. The recipes I have for bread using biga or poulish typically also have an extra dose of yeast, but if you can spare the time it probably isn't necessary, and the longer/slower the ferment the better the flavor, within reason. If you have instant bread yeast, you could also look into the NY Times no knead bread recipe, which is easily available online, or the overnight white recipe in the book Flour Water Salt Yeast, which both use very small amounts of yeast, The FWSY recipe uses about 1/4 teaspoon or less from memory. Head over to r/Breadit for more advice.